Hello, everyone and our family. I'm happy to have Paul Theriot record a history of my life. I have had quite an exciting life. It hasn't been extra special to anyone else, but it has to me and hopefully to my family. So I'll start with when I was born. January 11th, 1926. I was born in our home. We had a very nice home. There was no hospital or no doctors. We had a midwife, Sister Richards, and she lived about a mile out of town, but she was there, and apparently I was born without any problems. I was the eighth of a family of 9 here in our family. My father was Jesse Levi Jolley, and he was on a mission when I was born. My mother was Mary Leona Johnson Jolley. My father was on this mission in the southern states. I got my name from my father riding home from his mission. My older sisters was afraid he would send me Bible names. I ended up with Aaron Floyd Jolley. Of course, Aaron was a Bible name. I had older brothers and sisters. My oldest brother was Rex Jolley, and then I had a sister Maggie, and a sister Jessie, and a sister Maggie, and then Bertha, and then Arbin, and William or Bill, and Joel, and then my name Aaron, and then my sister Rose. That was 9 in the family. They were all healthy family. I never remember having any problems. Of course, I don't remember the older ones very well. Most of them are gone. I can just remember Bill and Joel pretty much. But I lived in Tropic, and Tropic was had about 500 people. It was settled very neatly with blocks. And there's 4. The blocks were split into 4 so that each corner had a space for a residential home. Our block was right in the middle of Tropic, and we were on the northeast corner, and then Shakespeare's are on the northwest corner. Then on the southwest corner was the Tropic High School, and on the southeast corner was our recreation hall. It was an older building, and it was originally, I think, a church that was held there, but it was also a recreation for our high school. We played basketball there, had a stage, and then on our block, our 4th of the block, we had our home and then a garden to the west of us, and then to the south we had southwest we had the barn and kraals and chicken coops, 2 chicken coops, and then in the south east corner we had the post office. My mother was postmistress for 30 years, and so all my life I spent some time in the post office with her. We had a garden, we had fruit trees, and it was a very comfortable situation, a comfortable home, a lovely home. Before I was born, some years before I was born, my uncle Leo was a carpenter, and he constructed our home. It was probably one of the nicest ones in the town. It had a bathroom bathtub and a toilet and a little heater, a little wood burning heater. And so we were very comfortable. However, I remember in the winter sometime as a little child of my mother giving me a bath in the kitchen in a wash tub. And my sister and I, well, we got bathed there because they didn't take time to build a fire in the bathroom. Anyway, talking about the hall, we had their basketball games there, and then we didn't have a movie house there, but every week a man came from Panguage and brought his equipment and put on a show for us. And I remember that I was also anxious to get to that show once a week. They had a continuous show first, and then they had a regular show after that. And so it was a very good place. Our church was about a block and a half from us. They had built a new church, and so we had a nice church house. As I grew up, I had many experiences. I'll have to tell you, my older brother Arbin and Rex went to BAC, Bank Agricultural College in Cedar City, and my Rex got interested in farming stuff, and so he brought home 2 goats, a little nanny and a billy, and gave them to me, and I gave the nanny to my cousin Sheldon, and I had this goat, and as he grew up, well, he had long horns, and my neighbor to the west, Mr. Mr. Shakespeare, built me a cart. He used wheels that come off old washing machines, and then he built a box and then shafts for this billy goat that I had. He was growing and got pretty big. And my mother ordered a harness and a bridle from Montgomery Ward's. And so we had a new harness and a bridle that I could drive with long reins, and I could drive from sitting in the cart. I was quite an attraction when tourists, and I was out on the street and tourists come along. I remember them stopping and talking to me. But anyway, this billy goat was a lot of fun. We made a little krell for the goat right next to the granary, and my dad didn't know this, but there was a little hole in the granary, and where they put in the wheat and the oats, and it would sift out into the little board underneath, and the goat, he kept pretty happy and fat from this here. Anyway, just to talk about the goat, I tested the goat one time, how much he could pull in this cart, and we had 100 pounds of phosphate, and I put 500 on the cart, and he pulled it out of the krell and up in around the schoolhouse and back down, so we knew that he could pull it. At one time, and we had a walkway between the house and the post office. It was just a dirt walk, and so I put gravel all along that walk with the billy goat. But I had a lot of fun with the goat. He'd follow me around. I had a dog called Pete, so Billy and Pete, and they would follow me around. I didn't even have to put a line on them. So that was kind of an interesting thing for me as a little boy. A little small, dark dog, black dog with a white on his head. I don't know what kind he was, but he was a good dog. He followed me wherever I went. And he and the goat sometimes would come down to the house, and they'd go to dry her up at the window and blat, and for me to come out and play with them. So that was one of my things that I played with. I of course, enjoyed school, and I did well in school. My school teacher lived kind of out of town, and next to him was a bachelor called Pete Harmon. And so she gave me a dog, and we called the dog Pete for her boyfriend. And one of the interesting things that Sheldon and I did, I had a brother-in-law that knew how to trap, and he taught us how to dig a hole and put a trap in and put a canvas over it and dirt. And so we decided we'd go up in the hills. My dad had bought a lot of property up in the foothill, and there was a large hill there. I wouldn't call it a mountain, but a hill. You'd go up quite a ways, and then it was flat on top. Well, and there was trees and brush and all there. So we took our two traps, and we went up there and on top of this hill and set our traps. Well, we needed bait. My dad had cattle, and they were grazed there in this field. There was, I don't know, 100 acres or so. I don't know how big it was. Anyway, one of the young cows fell off a bank. There's a wash that went down through this, and the cow fell off the bank and to the bottom of the wash and killed the calf. And it wasn't a calf, it was a half-grown one. Anyway, it laid there for quite a while, but we decided we'd skin it and take the meat up on the mountain. So we did. We started skinning it, but it laid there so long and it stunk so bad that we could only stay down there for a little while. We'd have to get up and go up top and breathe for a little bit, and then we'd go back and skin. Well, we cut off the hind quarter of this here calf, and we drug it, this cow, we drug it up the side of this hill and used that as a bait to attract the animals. Well, about every day or two, we would go up and check the traps. Marion, who was the brother-in-law, told us that not to shoot, if we got something, not to shoot it because you need to skin it and send the furs in and get money from it. Well, we carried a long stick, about 4 feet long, something like that, special stick. We carried that up and down every time we went, and so one time we got there and the traps had been tripped, and there was a rabbit, a jackrabbit in it, and he had been, I guess it had been several days since we'd been up there, but it had died. And so, of course, we didn't skin it, we just disposed of it, and we set our traps again, and we went up, and we caught a ringtail cat. It was dead. It had been there for a day or two, and he'd kind of dug around and drug the traps. But anyway, I'd never heard of a ringtail cat. But anyway, we had a friend, not a friend, but an older fellow. He was just 2 or 3 years older that had lived at a ranch, and he knew how to skin animals. And so we took him up, or we brought him down, the ringtail cat down, and he skinned it for us. We dried it and sent it in to the fur place. I can't remember the name of it, and I think we got it $1.50 for this here ringtail cat. Well, we kept trapping. We went up and checked their traps, and we carried our stick and it was all ready. And then one day we went up, and it was cold cold. I can't. It was late in the fall, and our traps were gone. The ground was all dug up around, and the traps were gone. Boy, we thought we had something pretty big, and so we started following the trail where they drug the traps, and he drug it over to the edge of the mountains where it sloped down, and then there was a kind of a ravine that went off down, and down in this here ravine was some limbs, and in these limbs, why, the head of a skunk was sticking out. And so I had my club I'd carried, and so I scooted down. This is kind of a steep slope. I scooted down there and raised that club, and the back end of this skunk come out, and I whirled to get out of the way, but it was slick, and I wasn't getting out. Anyway, he hit me right across my back of my coat, and so we decided we'd have to get a gun to kill this skunk. But we went down to town, and my cousin, an older cousin, had a store right across the street from our home, and a little grocery store. And so we went down, and this was cold, kind of cold weather, and there had a big pot-bellied stove in this store, and some chairs around it, and a lot of older men would come in the store, and they'd sit there and talk there. So we went in, and I walked up to the stove, and turned my back to it, and pretty soon they started to holler, "Skunk, skunk!" And of course we couldn't keep from laughing, and they chased us out. And so we went over across the street to my home, took the jacket off that I had and hung it on a line. Then we got my .22, and we went up to shoot the skunk. And I got up there, and for some reason I lost the bullets out of my pocket. I must have had a hole, I can't remember what. But I remembered I had a .22 short bullet in my jacket pocket. And so I got that out, and I shot the skunk, and we drug it down to the bottom of the hill. And then the next day, we went up to, we got a hold of this friend, or this fellow that skinned them for us, went up, and we went up to the foot of the hill, and he started skinning the skunk. And it was cold, very cold, and I had a little dog, a little woolly dog that followed me up there. And so I thought, well, he could put his hands in this dog's fur and then get warm. So I turned around to get the dog, and he was running down, headed for home. So he had to persevere and finish skinning this skunk, and we brought it down and dried the hide and sent it in. I think we got $1.50 out of it for the skunk. When I was about 16, 17, my father had bought a ranch called out south of Tropic and called Yeller Creek. There was a little creek that come through, and there was a fields, and there was a chicken coop, the chicken wire around it, but there was turkeys there. They had about 30 turkeys, white turkeys, and of course had a krells and all, and we had some cattle there, and we mowed the hay, and then we'd rake it up into windrows, and then we'd go and make piles out of it. And here in Yellow Creek there was a lot of snakes, rattlesnakes, and we had killed one or two of them. And in fact, we had a matchbox that's about half full of rattlesnake rattles. And I had a special pony, a little buck, that I rode. And one time we were going along, and a little buck jumped aside, about left me. I was in a saddle, fortunately. And of course, a rattlesnake was there, and so I got my .22 and tried to get close to it. And the horse was so nervous, he keeps switching his tail and wiggling. But I finally shot the snake, and of course got out and took the rattler off it. But getting back to the field, we piled the hay, and then when it dried, well, then we'd go with the wagon and take the pitchfork and pick it up and throw it onto the wagon, and then you'd go back and take the pitchfork and scrape up the droppings, and then switch it back in front of me and make a little pile. Well, this one time I switched it and pulled a rattlesnake from right beside of me, right out in front of me here. He could have bit me, I guess, if I hadn't have raked him out in front, but of course, I had the pitchfork, and I used the pitchfork to take care of him. Anyway, that's a rattlesnake story. My older brother came to live with us, or come back to Tropic, and he and I bought 100 head of old ewes, sheep, and it was springtime, and we had them out at Yeller Creek. And we'd turn them out into the fields and the area during the day, and then bring them back into the kraal at night. And then in the spring was lambing time. And of course, these old ewes started lambing. And Rex was there taking care of them, but he got sick and found out he had appendicitis, so he had to go and have an operation. So I quit school, or went out of school. Time was on, but I went out of school. Went out for 28 days. I stayed at Yeller Creek and herded these these sheep in, and took care of the lambing and so forth. I remember one lamb was deformed, the face, and the eye was right in the middle of its head, but it didn't live, unfortunately. Anyway, I had several experiences there. I would, of course, had food there, but each night I would go down along the alfalfa field, and the brush was at the side, and the cottontail rabbits would come out into the field to feed on the alfalfa. And so I'd go down each night and shoot a cottontail and skin it and take the back part of it and the hind legs and soak them during the night, and then I cooked them for breakfast. And I did that many nights. The only company I ever had was another cousin was coming through, and he stopped and had dinner with me. My dad came out once and brought food, supplied me with food, and so I was there for 28 days. And my brother Joel was going down to the college down in St. George, but he got through, and so he came and out after 28 days and took over my job. And I came back and finished school that year, so I didn't fail. I was able to. The year before, I had left school about 2 weeks ahead of time and went to Salt Lake to live with my daughter, my sister, Jessie. Jessie and Claude had moved there, and Claude worked out at Dugway Proving Grounds, an Army base, building barracks there for the wax for the women. And so he took me out and got me a job there. So I was there for quite a while. And only one thing that I'll mention, they're digging a trench and running a pipe through it. And when the pipe connect, so I had to stuff cement around this here connection. So they put me down in this trench, and I was stuffing all day long. I was stuffing cement into this here pipes without any gloves, just bare hands. Next morning, I could hardly close or open my hands. They were swollen up, so I had to lay around or do other things for 2 or 3 days until my hands healed. Well, that was my experience in that spring. When I was around 10 or 12, my father and older brothers, Rex and Arbin, had a goat herd. They had bought a goat herd, had 300 or 400 head of Angora goats. They had them down south of Tropic and down in the lower country, we called. And I remember Arbin and Rex, particularly Rex, was herding the goats. And I went down a time or two and was there, and they had a tent and all, and they had a milk goat along with all these Angora goats, and that supplied them milk. Anyway, that was quite an experience to go down to this goat herd. And they brought, in the wintertime, they brought the goats up to Tropic, and these property around the hill that I was telling you about in the skunk, they grazed around the hill and the property there. They had a shed and a krill out out on this property, and I remember going and in springtime when they had the lambings, they'd have them in the kraal, the lambs, but the lambs, when they went out, they would get sleepy and they'd lay down and sleep and go off and leave the herd would leave them. So they'd never take the lambs out with, I should say, the kids out. They put a little barrier across the gate that the kids couldn't jump over. And after they were gone, I'd move the gate, and I'd herd the little kids out on a wide area, and there were some logs and things. I remember them getting up on these logs and just jumping around and all. So that was kind of an interesting experience. But then in the summer, I remember going down to the lower country and seeing these sheep, herding those sheep. Of course, they brought it in the spring. They had a shearing kraal, and the shearers would come from Circleville or some other place and shear the goats. And they had a big high bag that they would put the goat hair in. And I remember when they got near the top, I got in that and I'd jump up and down and tamp the hair down. But we were about, I guess, 2-3 miles from Tropic, this here shearing kraal was. And the shearers stopped at lived at our place, and they got up early and left. And one morning they didn't wake me up, and I remember I woke up and they'd gone. And I run all the way from home, clear up to the shearing kraal, so I'd be there to help them with the shearing. So that was a great experience. I remember them Rex herding some of the sheep, and they had another huge field apart from what I'd talked about before. But they had the sheep would feed in that field, or the goats, I'm getting mixed up here. My goats and my sheep. But anyway, they decided to turn the goats back to the previous owner, and so they gathered up all the goats they could find, and they got off and left them, and then they gathered up and took them back to Circleville, I think it was, back to the owner again. And a little bit later, why a fellow in Cannonville said he'd like to round up all the goats that was down there. So he said if Dad would let him do that, why he'd give him 8 head of cattle. And so we got 8 head of cattle, and he went and rounded up the rest of the goats they could find. And we got into the cattle business. He started raising cattle, and we had quite a herd, built up quite a herd. And of course we had those fields that we grazed them in the winter time. And in the summer we took them up on the mountain. They called the East Fork of the Sevier River, and it was a great valley up there, and it's a stream running through it, and a lot of grass and all. And this and all a lot of the other men in the town took all their cattle up there during the summer. And I remember we took ours up through Bryce Canyon. We were down in the base of Bryce Canyon. We took them up through Bryce Canyon and left them there during the summer. We had a reservoir there, and I remember going up and fishing at the reservoir. And Richie had fish in this here stream. This East Fork of the Sevier had fish in it, and we would catch fish there. And so a number of times during the summer we went up, and my brothers and I and others did. And then in the fall we'd go up and have a roundup. All the men, boys, would round up all the cattle and bring them down. And they didn't bring them down through Bryce Canyon. They had them bring a roundabout where they called down through over the dump into Tropic, because it was down in the canyon. Anyway, I went on. I remember once going on this roundup, and I had my own horse, of course, and it was in the fall and kind of cold, but it was quite an experience. We'd bring them down. Of course, in the spring, we branded them and earmarked them and took them up on the mountain. When we get all back, we went to a big trail down below Tropic and segregated them out, picked out ours, and others picked out their brands and all, and then they'd bring them up and put them on this land that we had. So we built up quite a herd of cattle. So I had quite an experience with fishing up there on the East Fork of the Sevier, and taking the cattle up through Bryce Canyon, and then going bringing them back down. I had a special pony, old Buck, and he was a buckskin horse. Anyway, that was another little sidetrack on what I did as a boy. I went to Tropic High School, and all the students from Henryville, which is 9 miles away, and Cannonville, about 5 miles away. Henryville come up through Cannonville, so the school bus brought all the students from there up to high school, there in Tropic High School. But it wasn't an awfully lot of special classes there. Reading and writing and arithmetic, so forth, was pretty much the schedule. But they did have a typing class, and so I did learn to type. That was one thing special. But I always thought I'd like to learn more things. Anyway, I had a cousin in Tropic that was almost members of the church. There was only 2 families that weren't members of the church, and they were just couples. But I only had about one real good friend, and that was Sheldon Johnson. He was my cousin. And I had the other 2 or 3 that I played with sometimes, but they weren't active in the church. Sheldon and I were the deacons pretty much, and we were the teachers, and we were the priests. And we administered the sacrament and all. So about 2 or 3 years before school was out, Sheldon's folks moved to St. George. So Sheldon was gone for a couple of years. And so he and his family and he and his parents invited me to come down and stay with them and go to school there at St. George, Dixie High School. But at that time, the Dixie College only had girls there. There was only one young man there. He was 4F. He wasn't drafted. So there was all these here college girls, and many of our classes were with these college girls. And I took some special classes. I remember I took ornamental metal craft and carpentry and geometry and several classes. I had about 18 hours of signed up there, but I really enjoyed it. Anyway, back in a little bit, they invited me to come down, and so I went down and went to school there for the year. And we had a nice time. I mean, it was enjoyable. We had a few group girls. We didn't much have. I remember Sheldon and I sitting around. Well, in Tropic, we didn't have a telephone. The telephone was about a block and a half from where we lived, and I don't know that I ever talked on the telephone. But there, we would sit around the phone and decide who we was going to call and make a date with, and I was as scared of the telephone as I was calling the girls. Anyway, I mention that because it fits in later in my life. I enjoyed the school very much, and of course I turned 18 in January 11th, and I was subject to draft, but we decided that, well, I had a brother in the Navy and two brothers in the Coast Guard, and I decided I'd probably want to go in the Navy. But Sheldon and I decided we wanted to go in the Air Force, and so we bought some brown shoes and all. We were planning on the Air Force. About that time, they put 10,000 Air Force cadets into the Army. They didn't need them there anymore. So we couldn't plan on that. So I thought, well, when I graduate, I'll join the Navy. Well, about 2 or 3 weeks before I graduated, I received my draft notice. I have to report to the draft office. So I did. I have reported to the draft office, and they set my induction a week or two after I graduated. And so after I graduated, they bused a 75 from down there, put on buses, and took us up to Salt Lake to the induction center there, at Fort Douglas. And we were there for a day in, I can't remember, introductions and so forth. Then the next day, they were all there, and there were at least 75, but there could have been 100, 150 there in that room, and they called out 4 names and told us to report topside. One of those names was mine, and when we got to the top of the stairs, all the fellows were in Navy uniforms, and so I was inducted into the Navy. How that ever happened, I'll never know. It may have saved my life. I didn't get inducted into the Army, and I didn't have to go fight in the Army. But I was put on the train. 4 of us put on the train, and we went up to Farragut, Idaho, in training camp there. And I just got there for a week or two to start training. And they asked me to go and work in the post office. I don't know that they knew that I had lived my whole life going to the post office. I don't know that I'd ever mentioned that, but why they asked me to go and work in the post office. So I missed out on a lot of the marching and exercises and things that they did. Well, they after we were through training, they called out, I think it was 4 or 5 foreman names again, and mine was one of them. And they sent me to Eureka Naval Section Base in California. It was a blimp base where the blimps patrolled the coast and afraid that the planes, the Japanese, would bomb the country here. Anyway, we were there for about 5, 6 months. I don't remember how many, but about all I did was guard duty and mess duty, and didn't accomplish much. But they finally decided they didn't need the blimps to patrol the coast, and so they decommissioned this base, and so all of them were sent out but me, and sent me down to Port Chicago, which was a ammunition storage base. They had maybe 7,500 storage units, magazines there, and had the barracks and all, and about a mile or so from this storage place. I was there for just a short time, and the crews would go up and we would unload train loads of ammunition and put in the barracks and into the magazines, and then they would load train loads and take them, car loads, and take them down to the San Francisco Bay. The bay runs back up within about 4 miles of the base, and there they would load ships and ship the ammunition down into the South Pacific. And so I was there for just a short time, and they asked me to be working in an office. They had a small office, a small building up where the magazines were. A lieutenant took care of this office, but they asked me to work in this office. And all I did pretty much was answer the telephone and take messages out to the magazine. Had a little scooter, and I'd take the messages out, but I had to answer the telephone. Now, getting back to telephones, I didn't know how to answer a phone. Of course, there you were very rigid how you answered. You had to say your name and then a little bit, I can't remember what it all was, every time I answered the phone. And I finally got used to that. And then we were on the late shift. We would eat about 11. We'd get up there about 1 o'clock and we'd work. The crew would work with the other crews until 5 o'clock, and then they would leave, and we would finish unloading the cars or loading the cars, whichever the situation was. Then if 7 or 8 o'clock when we got through, we'd go back to the base. But I had this office. I was the only one in this office for that period of time. Soon after I got there, they called my name out and sent me to Mare Island to ammunition storekeeper school. And so I went there and finished the school and become an ammunition storekeeper. And then I came back, and then they put me in this office there. That was one of the other things that I was chosen for. I don't know why. I wasn't that smart. I wasn't that experienced and all. I wasn't that handsome. So I think the Lord must have had something to do with all of this. These are not things that I just actually asked the Lord about. They were things that come about without my knowing, and yet they were very, very important to me. They kept me alive, possibly. I should have been shipped out in the Army, and I should have been shipped out with the Navy, but for some reason the Lord kept me in the country there. And so I attribute to, I'm so grateful for the gospel and the way of life it provides for us, and that I think that that had something to do with my life that far along. While at Port Chicago, having special duties, I also had special liberties. I could go on any night. I had liberty, and on weekends, all Saturday and Sunday, I had liberty to go. And at that time, my brother Arbin, who was in the Coast Guard, and my brother Joel was in the Coast Guard, and they were both stationed in San Francisco. And so I would go on Saturday and Sunday, I would go into San Francisco, and Arbin had been there for several years, and he met a young lady there and fell in love with her, and they went to Salt Lake and got married and came back, and Joel met a young lady there, but he eventually married her, but not while I was there. Anyway, Arbin and Barbara had an apartment, and so Joel and I lived with them. I would be there on weekends, and we would go to church, the San Francisco ward, and we'd go to the activities of the ward. So there was a number of girls from Utah went down there to work. This Barbara was one of them, and she got married, and Mary Jex was one of them, and of course later married Joel. But we had a lot of fun going to the beach and all. There was a group of girls and several of the fellows, and I remember I didn't date anyone a lot, but I remember one girl that made quite an impression on me. Her name was Betty Bloomquist. Her father was the mission president there in San Francisco. So anyway, we went to the beach, and someone had a car, but they didn't have enough. It was crowded, and so Betty had to sit on my lap when we went. And I remember when we got there, why, I could hardly walk when I got out of the car. And it was something a little funny. Anyway, she was a lovely girl, but I didn't marry her. And that was an interesting part. I would go to Oakland from time to time. I had a connection somewhere, and I knew when they was having their I'd go at MIA and the MIA dances, and I met several girls there. There was one particular one that I liked, and I dated her a time or two. And then there was a little town near Port Chicago. I haven't decided whether I think it was Concord. Anyway, there was a ward there, and there's a girl there that I dated several times, because I had liberty every night. Sometimes it was 8, 9 o'clock before I was able to leave. But that was my social life at Port Chicago. The war ended, and I hadn't had any sea duties. And at that time, they asked for volunteers to go down to Anahuac Islands, where they were testing atomic bombs. And so I signed up to go down. But just before we were ready to leave, about a week before we were ready to leave, my discharge came through. And so I was so happy to get discharged, I didn't have the sea duty. So I came home, and my folks had moved from Tropic to Salt Lake City. They had a nice home there, and I was there for just a short time. My dad, being a farmer, he decided he'd like to do some farming, so they bought a lot out on 39th South and 4th East, had a large garden and a barn and chicken coops and a rabbit hutch and so forth. And most of the farm or the yard was in this sweet corn. Anyway, we moved out there, and the next morning was Sunday. When we got settled, the next morning was Sunday, and so we went to church. And we ended up, we thought, in the Mill Creek ward. We should have been in the Valley Center ward, but we ended up there. And of course, after meetings, why a young lady came up. Her name was Louine Salisbury, and introduced herself and said that her boyfriend was in that ward, and that's why she was there, and told us that we were in the wrong ward. So the next Sunday, we went to the right ward, and there was a little red-headed girl played the organ. But anyway, we went through the classes and everything, and during the week we were harvesting the corn. We were taking out on the street, and cars come by and buy the corn. And my brother Rex was there for some reason, I don't know why, but he was helping my dad, and we were hauling the corn out. And so this girl that I'd met talked to her parents and coming by and buying some corn. Unfortunately, I was down in the field harvesting the corn, and Rex and Dad served them, and so they didn't get to see me. She had brought her sister along to see me, this red-headed girl. Well, that was too bad she didn't see me. Anyway, the next week was the opening social of MIA. During the summer, they didn't have MIA in those days, and they have an opening social in November, 1st of November. And so I decided I'd go to this opening social. I got there. They had a little meeting first, and I was a little late. I got there and met the MIA president, and she talked to me and asked if I wanted to dance. And so she said, well, let's go up about 10 steps to the cultural hall. We went up there, and there was just between dances, and there was, across the hall, there was probably 6 or 8 girls in a circle, and she took me over and introduced me to a little red-headed girl, and after asked her to introduce me to the rest of them. So she did, and what could I do? After that, I had to ask her to dance, so I did, and I danced with her for, I think, a couple of times after that. And then I danced with her the last dance and asked if I could take her home. Oh, she was very quiet, very nervous, and shy, I should say. Use the word shy. Anyway, she says, well, I'll have to ask my neighbor. She says, I came with a neighbor, and they lived just out of town. They had a farm and raised corn and all, but they didn't need to stop and buy corn. But anyway, that's a side story. Anyway, and she went and asked the neighbor what she thought about me taking her home. And I guess she looked me over and decided it'd be safe, and so he gave her permission to let me take her home. So I did, and I remember she was very quiet and shy all the way home. She asked me if I smoked. I thought later I should have said, yes, would you like a cigarette? But anyway, I didn't. I assured her that I didn't smoke. And then I, of course, dropped her off, and we were there for about a year, I guess, and I took her home several times from MIA, and I remember they invited me to dinner, and we invited her to dinner. Well, her name was Dorothy Salisbury, and she had turned just 16 about 2 weeks, on the 27th of August, 2 weeks before September. It was September. Anyway, about 2 weeks before I met her, she had turned 16. So that's why she was rather shy. I was 20. I dated her, started dating her after several months, and a little bit, and then we moved. But Dad decided he didn't want to be a farmer anymore, so we moved back into Salt Lake, and I went to the University of Utah, got me a job, and was there for 2 years. But during that time, I dated other girls a bit, and every little while I'd call Dorothy and make a date with her, and I'd go with her. I don't know how often, maybe every 2 or 3 weeks I dated Dorothy. And after 2 years, I decided I wanted to go on a mission. So I talked to the bishop and got my call, and at that time we dated quite frequently. But when my time for me to leave on my mission, we didn't make any promises, but we did decide we'd write to each other. So I went on my mission, and after a few months, the letters started slowing down. She'd miss a week or 2, so I wrote and told her that if she couldn't write every week, not to write at all. Well, I got letters every week from that on time. And I was called to the Northern States Mission, and the office was in Chicago. So I arrived in Chicago and met with President Hammond, and he assigned me to go to Angola, Indiana. And so I was there for about 6 months. I can't remember my companion's name, but we did tracting pretty much. There wasn't a branch there, and we didn't have any great conversions. But the mission had a conference down in Nauvoo, and so my companion and I went down to Nauvoo, and I was assigned to another companion and sent to Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And there we had pretty good success. We didn't convert anyone, but we felt very good about things. There I had an elder sitting. We decided we'd go out and teach without purse or script. And so we hitchhiked a ride out into the country and started contacting people. Well, we were quite successful in finding places to eat and also places to sleep. One night we slept under a tree, but it was interesting. The weather was good, and we met a lot of fine people. I didn't convert anybody that we know, but they knew about the Mormons after we got through. One night we didn't have any success in finding a home to sleep in. About 11 o'clock we contacted a house, and they turned us down, and so we turned and started walking away, and a police car drove up and picked us up and took us to the police station. And there they supplied us a bed in a jail cell. And it was better than under a tree. And the next morning they gave us some breakfast, and we went on our way. And we decided that we'd had enough without purse or script proselyting. So we went back down to the highway and hitched a ride back into Cedar Rapids. So that was one of the interesting things that happened in Cedar Rapids. They had a university there, and it was interesting with talking to students and all. But anyway, I was soon transferred over to Boone, Iowa. And I was called to be the branch president of the little branch there. And they had a large building. It was an old building, but they had the ward there, or the branch there, a room for quite a few, and we lived upstairs. There's a small apartment in the upstairs, and so we lived there, and we worked with the members and the less active members, and then we did tracting. And we one day we were tracting, and we met a young lady, and she was interested, invited us in, and we visited with her and made appointments for the future, and we met with her several times. And about that time, she was very interested. Her and her husband were very interested. They had 2 children, and it's Betty. Her name was Betty Hopp. Her husband was Ernest Hopp, Haupt, and I was released from my mission before they were baptized. They were baptized right after I left the mission, and I had bought a car, and I brought a older couple back to Salt Lake to go to the temple and take out their endowments. After I got home, I visited with the family. We got home in the afternoon. I visited with the family in the evening. And then the next morning I called a young red-headed girl that I had been corresponding with for 2 years. I called her up and surprised her, and she was very surprised, and had a nice visit. And I asked her for a date, and she said, well, they're having a dance. Mill Creek Steak is having a dance in Mill Creek, in Murray is where it was, and we could go there. And so I went out to pick her up. I get a little thrilling, I guess. Anyway, I went out, and she met me out on the porch, and I got there, and she was all dressed so beautifully and all. And we went to the dance and just had a nice dance. Found out later that she had a date with someone else for that dance, but she didn't keep it. Then from there, I got a job with Williams Supply Company, and she was working there, and we kept dating more seriously. And after about a month, I proposed to her, and she accepted. We drove up on the east side of Salt Lake Valley, up on the side of the mountain, and based the car around towards sea over the valley. And then I proposed to her, and she accepted. And so we were married 2 months later, in the 18th of December, 1950. And from that marriage, I'll just say that it was very successful. She was a very wonderful, wonderful wife, mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother. We had 7 children. At this point, we have 40 grandchildren. 20 of them are married. There's a returned missionary in every one of the families, and there's 2 missionaries in the 6 of the families. And at this point we have 53 great-grandchildren. Now I'll drop back to what I did. Dorothy and I, my sweetheart, was working, and I worked for a Williams Supply Company, and she was a secretary. I don't remember the company, but she was a very good secretary. They really liked her. We lived on 5th East and 5th South in a home that my dad and mother had bought, and It was a triplex. There was an apartment out upstairs and then two apartments on the main floor. Mother and Dad lived in the one apartment, and we moved into the other apartment. After about a year, my brother Arben came to visit me. He had recently bought a mortuary out in Vernal. It was the Swain mortuary, and he came in and talked me into coming out to Vernal and becoming a mortician. And he told me of the things that he could visualize doing. Of course, mortuary, you're not busy every day, and so we talked of having another business, getting another business, and so I didn't have any great plans. I was going to go to school, but go to the university. I had gone to the university before I went on the mission, but that was one of my plans. But that sounded pretty good idea, and so we went to Vernal. We lived in what was the Swain Funeral Home. Arben had developed another big home down the middle of this Vernal, and developed or arranged it into a mortuary. So all the facilities, and they lived in this building. When I first got there, then I got a job with the Adams Furniture Store. It couldn't keep me busy at the mortuary all the time, and so I worked at the furniture store. And then when he needed help, then I would go and help him. When we got into Vernal, as I mentioned, we lived in the Swain home. It was a big home, but we only used a couple of rooms of it. Soon after when we arrived, then we went. Mom and I went to church, and we got there early. The priesthood meeting was about to start, and we sat in the foyer there, and they come and ask if anyone could play the organ. And of course, Dorothy, my sweetheart, played the organ and piano very well. Well, she got up and waddled down the aisle to the organ. She was almost ready to have a baby, and she played the organ, and then we waited around. I went to priesthood, and she waited around till priesthood was over, and then ready for the meetings to start. Well, the organist didn't show up, so they asked her to come down. So she waddled down the aisle again and played the organ for them. Oh, it was interesting. Anyway, we started life there. After serving a year's apprenticeship there at the mortuary, it was time for me to go to a mortuary college. So Dorothy and I should back up and say that we had a baby. Her name was Julianne, sweet little Julianne. And she was born, and she was about 6 months old when we went to California. And we got an apartment there, and I went to mortuary college, and we celebrated her first birthday, I remember, out on the lawn in the apartment that we were living in. After finishing the 9-month school, then we came back to Vernal, and so I served as my apprenticeship, and became a full-fledged mortician. After I'd been there for 2 or 3 years, I can't remember the amount of years, I decided to, Arben's wife became kind of jealous of me. been spending too much time with me instead of with her, I think. Anyway, we decided to split up the partnership, and so we moved into, I went to Provo and got a job with Berg Mortuary. So we moved into Provo, and I served with Berg Mortuary for a while, not too long. Maybe a year, but I didn't like what they did there. I didn't like the mortuary and Berg more anyway, and so I heard that new mortuary up in Taylorsville was looking for help. So I drove up to Taylorsville. I mentioned before that the Lord must have had something to do with all the things that happened to me in the service, getting into the service and all. And I'll mention that Dorothy is the first girl I met and danced with after I got home from the service. And so that's another thing that I think that the Lord must have had something to do with it. I get a little emotional when I talk about that. Thank you.